Thank you for having me. I'll start with a simple but not so trivial observation, and that is the fact that the BEG has a preamble. Only a few German statutes have a preamble. Providing a statute with a preamble is always an indication that the legislator assigns an exceptional character to the statute. Accordingly, a preamble was also added to the BEG to emphasize the exceptional nature of this act. In the preamble, the legislator acknowledges the injustice and gives this injustice as the main reason why the BEG has been passed. The exceptionality of the injustice called for an exceptional statute. However, despite this preamble, for the legal sciences, the Federal Compensation Act was not so special. As pointed out by H.G. van Dam in his commentary on the BEG, he said, I quote, "The Federal Compensation Act does not create any exceptional provisions by which benefits are granted to a group of aggrieved persons on the basis of an ethical or political impulse. Rather, it is the consequence of the existing legal system as expressed in conventional laws, especially the Civil Code." I will argue in this paper that the doctrinal structure of the Act was as well as its interpretation and application relied heavily on doctrinal concepts from private law, especially the law of delicts. From a purely doctrinal point of view, the BEG was nothing exceptional or special. It was an outgrowth of an existing legal order, especially the civil law tradition. Typically, private law, in contrast to public law, focuses on the interaction of two private actors. The interaction of two private actors has certain characteristics the interaction of a private actor and the state is lacking. In private law, the actors are conceived as more or less equal and limited in their abilities to influence the action sphere of the other. The actors of private law are not considered omnipotent or omniscient. Accordingly, private law tries to address these issues in its normative assessment of the interaction. Applying this dogmatic structure of private law to the interaction of an aggrieved party and the persecuting state attributes the same characteristics to the persecuting state as to the private actor. That means the persecuting state is conceived as not omnipotent and not omniscient. In this view, my two research questions arise. And the first one is the question whether private law doctrine is actually the adequate legal framework to address the compensation for state persecution. But it also raises a second question of my paper, and that is the question of what history of the Nazi regime did the judiciary and the executive write based on private law doctrine. So I'm wondering, how did this change their perception of history? I used for this primarily compensation for suicide cases, because these are very well equipped to address these two questions. This is mainly due to the fact that the compensation for suicide is a concept previously unknown to private law, so they had to fit it into the already existing system without creating inconsistencies. However, I have to admit the case sample is derived mainly from for a legal journal for compensation law. It's called the Rechtsprechung zur Wiedergutmachung. It is very difficult to find free other cases just by looking at archives, because you would have to look through all the files, and that's difficult. So I'm looking only at the ones that were published in this journal. In this presentation, I will first explain the dogmatic structure of the claim for compensation from the BEG and compare its dogmatic structure to the general tort claim from civil law. And this comparison is mainly modeled on the court's approach, less on the wording of the two norms, more on what the courts actually do when they apply the law. And in the end, I will also give you a quick example for one of the dogmatic concepts you can find in the structure. All right, qualifying the general tort claim. So even though the BEG has been changed 3 times in the 1950s, the first sentence of the claim for damage has not been changed until 1965. So this is my main basis. It says entitlement to compensation for loss of life applies if the persecuted person was intentionally or recklessly killed or driven to his or her death. So this is the norm from the BEG I'm looking at. And then we have the general tort claim from the BGB, this German Civil Code. And that says anyone who intentionally or negligently injures the life, body, health, freedom, property, or any other right to another unlawfully is obliged to compensate the other for the resulting damage. Again, the wording does not seem too similar, but if you look at how the courts apply these two norms, it becomes a bit more obvious. So the first thing you would do as a legal scholar when applying these two norms is to look at the violation of a legal interest. So that would be the first step, looking at the violation for a legal interest. In the case of the German Civil Code, you have a list of legal interests that can be violated: life, body, health, freedom, property, or any other rights. In the case of the Federal Compensation Act, it's for this norm only the loss of life. However, and this is very important, and I think we already got this notion by several presentations, a legal interest is not just a general interest. So in this case also, especially when it comes to the compensation for suicide, it is not enough that you just had a suicide that was more or less related to persecution. It needed to be a specific special type of suicide that was compensable. And this is the first dogmatic structure I identified in which the two questions can be addressed rather well. And that's the question of the compensable suicide. So after you have established that a legal interest has been violated, what the courts then go on to do is they look at the act of violation itself. And this has to have a specific structure, which is better pointed out by the wording in the German Civil Code: anyone who injures. So we have a subject that is acting, that is doing an active act. We have a passive structure with the Federal Compensation Act. However, the courts, in their understanding, use this construct from the German Civil Code. So even in their approach to the persecution, they always have this idea that there was a specific identifiable persecutor that specifically targeted an individual, and by that means drove that person to his or her death. And this is also the field I'm taking my example from to make a bit more clear why this can be a problem. But this is the second dogmatic structure that is well to address these issues. After this act of violation has been established, a legal scholar would go over to the next object or element, and that's the subjective element: intentionally or recklessly, or in the case of the German Civil Code, intentionally or negligently. And as you might think, this becomes heavily contested, especially in the court cases. A subjective element always has an element of knowledge to it, even if you act recklessly. So in the courts, in the court files, you find a lot of discussions on whether the individual Gestapo member did actually have knowledge of what was going on or not, if he or she did actually act intentionally or recklessly in this context. And this is then the third dogmatic structure where you can answer these two questions. And the last one you can't actually see within the norms. This is something you know when you have legal training, and that is the requirement of adequate causality. And this very much derives from the German Civil Code, and actually most of the court cases quoted in the context of the BEG stem from the German Civil Code. So they most of the times don't rely to any BEG cases. They are very much relying on delicts law. And adequate causality is a rather complex structure, but the basic idea behind it is not just enough that the action was causal, but it also needs to be adequate in the sense that it can be reasonably imposed on the tortfeasor or persecutor. And this is always a requirement that leads to a lot of cases being denied in the end. So these are the 4 dogmatic structures I identified, which you can use to answer these the initially asked questions. And I'll now give you an example for the requirement for individual persecution. So let's go. Until 1937, Kurt L. was an authorized signatory at a company that went bankrupt during the boycotts. After that, he found a position for a short time, but then lost it again due to the Iranization of the company. In 1938, at the age of 46, L and his wife emigrated to Colombia, where he did not succeed in creating a new livelihood for the family. Due to the economic hardship, L took his life on May 7, 1940. The case of Kurt L. presents 2 decisive problems in the application and interpretation of the BEG, one of which is the requirement of individual persecution. In L's case, the restitution authority denied the claim of his widow with the argument that L did not kill himself due to the actions that were individually directed against him. The argument of the restitution authorities based on the conviction that the Federal Compensation Act only grants compensation in those cases in which an identifiable state-related persecutor used violent measures against the aggrieved party, meaning a state official needed to come by and threaten him personally. This conviction mimics doctrinal assessments from the law of delicts. Section 823 of the German Civil Code can only apply if there is an identifiable tortfeasor. In the case that there is just an aggrieved party, Section 823 of the German Civil Code cannot be applied. Similarly, in compensation cases for suicide, the argument is used that the identifiable state-related persecutor is missing. Accordingly, the sole existence of an aggrieved party does not justify compensation under the BEG. Several restitution authorities argued that the requirement of an identifiable perpetrator is not fulfilled if, I quote, only the historical guilt of the National Socialist rulers for the policies directed against the Jews is pointed out. In this understanding, historical guilt is equated with a general danger for which the state would not have to assume liability towards the individual. Rather, this liability is already discharged by the mere enactment of the BEG. For the restitution authorities, the legislation against the Jews is precisely not a clearly definable act of violence that emanated from an individual perpetrator, but a part of this historical guilt. The term historical guilt opposed to individual persecution derives from the acknowledgements of the preamble to the BEG. From the perspective of the restitution authorities, the conduct and acts of the executive, judiciary, and legislator, insofar as they only created a general threat, are not acts of persecution within the meaning of the BEG. The exclusion of a general hazards from the liabilities of an individual are continued in context of the application and interpretation of the BEG. In context of the German Civil Code, excluding the realization of general hazards makes perfect sense, because these are hazards the individual has no control over. In context of the application of the BEG, however, it is very questionable in how far you can discharge these general hazards from the liability of the state. And it also supports a view of the Nazi history in which the acts are primarily the mishaps of a few. Only a few individuals did violent acts and the rest is kind of discharged from this historical guilt. The reparation authorities' distinction between individual persecution and the mere historical guilt therefore trivializes the actions of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. In contrast to this argument of the restitution authorities, the Federal Supreme Court argued that the acts, as well as the conduct of the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, constituted acts of persecution within the meaning of the Federal Compensation Act. However, the cooperation of several perpetrators would not contradict the requirement of an identified perpetrator, since I quote, "Such a planned and organized cooperation of officials of the state or the party, possibly the help of other citizens, is characteristic for the measures of the National Socialist rulers aimed at the persecution and extermination of the Jews." Despite the clear friction between the interpretation of the Federal Supreme Court and the restitution authorities, both agree on the fact that only an individualization of the harmful act can justify a claim for compensation. In the interpretation of the Federal Supreme Court, however, this persecutor can also be an unspecified group of actors. What they actually did, instead of arguing there was not the individual Gestapo man Müller who knocked at the door of Kurt L., they argued you just have to go up the chain and you address the identifiable persecutor are then Hitler, Heydrich, and the elite Nazis and not. But what they also didn't do is to argue that you don't need this identifiable perpetrator at all. So both in their own way still are acknowledging the fact that you need an identifiable perpetrator in the application of the BEG. And this kind of leads to the perception that that these were all individual offenses and not systematic crimes in the end. So after this quick example, I'll go to my conclusion. Due to its epistemic structure, private law doctrine is not equipped to address the damages done by systematic state persecution, just by the fact that you, in private law, you always need two individuals interacting that are identifiable. Hence, if you have a persecuting state, it's not so identifiable anymore. Using private law doctrine, despite its epistemic shortcomings in the compensation for state persecution, trivializes state atrocities by demarking them as individualized mishaps, so they are denying them their mass character. And last but not least, through the lens of private law, the Nazi regime is nothing more than a larger accumulation of individual wrongdoings. It is essentially nothing exceptional from any other criminal offense, just the fact that it has been much more criminal offenses than just the ones in criminal court. Thank you.